Always a lovely treat for me here on The Fringe to have an author in studio. Today's author is Paul Edmondson, originally from Salford in England, living in Waterford, and he has brought out a great book which he was kind enough to send to me in the post a few weeks ago called The Great Spirit of Yosemite, and he is here to talk all about that and to chat a little bit about himself as well, if you're up for it. Paul, how are you?
We'll give it a go, and thanks very much, Mary, for inviting me in.
No bother at all. No bother at all. So Salford in England, how did you end up here? Tell me a little bit about all that.
Salford in England, yeah, from the red side of Manchester. I've got to get that in, especially for Damien, who's a Man United supporter, so from the Old Trafford end. I originally came over here in 1982 to join my brother, who had a pharmaceutical company here, so that's actually what brought me over. I'm still here, spent over half my life living in and around Waterford, Dunmore East. And
nice
Waterford
places.
City itself. Absolutely, yeah. Waterford's a great county. It's a lovely county.
You've kept your accent. I know when you go home, people probably tell you you haven't, but to me, you've still got a lovely Manchester accent.
Thanks, yeah. Despite how many pints of Guinness I have, the accent still stays Manchester. Although you're absolutely right. When I go back to Manchester, Old Trafford, I was thinking, where are you Irish speaking, you know?
so funny, isn't it?
It's just the way
how
it
our
is,
ears hear things so differently.
Yeah.
So you have obviously done a little bit of travelling, and you've been to Yosemite in California. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to hear a bit about your writing, because I know you're involved with Waterford Writers.
Yeah, well, the original writing, and I'm raising a name here, you know very well, as we mentioned on this programme lots of times. I went to start to do some creative writing with Mark Roper.
Yeah, Mark's name comes up.
He
so
comes
often.
up over and over, and rightly so as well. He's a great tutor, he's a great mentor, and a lovely guy to boot. You know, a very encouraging guy. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, that's a few years ago. I didn't really start writing till I retired. And it was going through some of Mark's original creative writing classes at the Adult Education Centre that spurred me on. But also going to the likes of the Molly Keane Writers' Retreat, you know, with Lanny O'Hanlon and Tom McCarthy. And I was lucky enough to get a bursary through the Arts Council, through Margaret Organ. So I had a lot of one-to-one sessions with Grace Wells, so I was really fortunate in having some wonderful mentors. So that's what brought me into writing. And I suppose 2.5 years ago nearly now, I knew two gentlemen, Tom Molan and Dominic McGuigan.
Yeah, I've interviewed Tom a couple of times.
You have indeed, yeah. In fact, connection with the Waterford Writers Group, and we'll probably come on to that in a minute. But we just sat together around Dominic's kitchen table and mulled around the idea of trying to form a writers group. There seemed to be an opportunity within Waterford, and that's literally what we did. And through our own personal contacts, you know, especially through being with the writers group with Mark Roper, the writing classes, we all knew somebody that was interested in writing. So we just pulled it together. Had our first meeting in April 2 years ago, and it's just grown phenomenally since then. We've got a really good group of writers.
Obviously, it's great to be in a writers group, and what I find about Waterford authors is that Waterford authors really do like to support one another. I'm sure it's the same in other places as well, and kind of egg each other on and give each other encouragement, because I used to think writing was a very solitary career, but I'm starting to change my mind now that I see how much you guys all collaborate with one another.
Oh, it's far from individual. An example of that outside our own group would be we've struck up a very close association with the Red House Poets in Lismore, both in terms of contributing, for example, to Dacia Voices, which they released a couple of years ago. But we also meet on occasions. We meet, the last time we met was just before the lockdown in Dungarvan. So the two groups got together just for a lovely evening of reading.
Brilliant, isn't it?
So, yeah, there is a close cooperation, and you're absolutely right. Within Waterford, how people do get together and encourage each other, not within the individual groups, but also by collectively pulling ourselves together. And
so many great festivals and everything. Let's talk about your book, The Great Spirit of Yosemite, and thank you for sending it to me. I've really enjoyed it. It's I'm going to let you kind of give the premise of it, but I was saying to you via email, it's taught me a lot about, I suppose, the Native American people, especially in that Californian area, and how they were just completely I suppose, disregarded and treated so barbarically, and how recently all that happened. We're looking at kind of around the time of the gold rush you set this. First of all, before you talk more about the book and the subject matter of it, why did you decide to write about Yosemite and the Native American people?
Well, that came by a circuitous route, to be honest with you. I didn't go there with the intention of actually researching and writing. I actually went there originally in the fall of 2014 on a photographic workshop with a wonderful landscape photographer called Michael Fry. And that was in the Eastern Sierra. And in fact, that was in and around Mono Lake, which actually appears within the book. Part of the story takes place there. But after finishing the workshop, I then went off into Yosemite myself for 10 days, just for photography. There's very little water around there at that time. So, in fact, I went back there again in the spring of 2016, the last week in May and the first week in June, because that's when the snow melt is. So, unfortunately, being a lot of snow, so there's a lot of waterfall evidence there to take the photographs of the waterfall. But wherever I was, I would write down in my notebook where I was and what I was photographing. And one of the locations and what I was photographing was a mountain with 3 peaks, and this was called the Three Brothers. And when I got back home, I followed up on wherever I'd been and do a little bit of research on it. And it turns out that the 3 brothers were the 3 sons of Chief Tenaya. And
Chief Tenaya is the main character in this book. The subheading is that it's the story of Chief Tenaya.
Yes, absolutely. I've made him the main character.
Yeah.
And in fact, he was the chief of the Ahwahnees, as they call themselves, or Yosemites, as they came to be called, in the middle of the 19th century. So around the 1850s and before. At that time, because of the gold rush, there was the Mariposa Indian War, where the Mariposa Battalion was formed and, in fact, if you like, invaded Yosemite because of the resistance of the indigenous peoples that were living there and had lived there for thousands of years.
And I think that's the really shocking part of the book, that they were there for so long, and, you know, the Palefaces, as they called them, obviously, you know, the white settlers, most of them mad to get a bit of gold and mine gold, just seemed to have no real regard for utterly uprooting them.
Well, there was no regard. Yeah. I mean, they effectively had no rights to the land that they'd occupied for thousands of years. Whereas after the Mexican-American War, all California, as it became to be known, was ceded from the Mexicans to the Americans. But there was no land rights for the indigenous peoples that were living there. There just simply weren't any land rights. And then the gold rush, of course, brought a lot of pressure on the indigenous populations that were living there. And with no rights, it was just very easy for the white people just to simply take over their lands and effectively just put them into reservations. I mean, it's still a problem today.
So this book is about real characters and real people. I mean, you clearly put a huge amount of research into it, not just in terms of the history, but in terms of who the people were, how they lived, how they hunted for food, I suppose how they felt when all this started to happen, what it was like for the women and children.
Yeah, I will emphasise it as a fiction, but I've based it very much in as many historical facts as I could put together. So it is authentic in that context.
Yeah, and you have some details about the tribes and that in the book at the start as well.
Absolutely, but it's always with a little bit of caution. You've got to remember that the indigenous peoples at that time didn't write. Their communication was verbal.
Okay.
So they had actually nothing written down. So it's what people who could write, the white people, have taken and interpreted themselves, and I've had to further interpret it. But I've been true to the history as far as I practically can, and I've tried to be as far as I can true to the honour of the indigenous people who were, as you say, treated abominably. They were treated terribly.
You got this book published?
Yes.
What sort of a process was that?
Tortuous.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I'm making things sound as if it's in a straight line, but it was very much a calf path. It wandered all over the place, to get to where I am. I have a very good friend, Dimpna Dreyer, who's actually published 4 books herself, Waterford lady, who's published 4 books herself, so very experienced. But we've always got on very well. We'd meet up for coffees and what have you. And she knew I was writing something around this, and I was very passionate about it. And so she asked to see it. So I sent her probably what was the first draft. And she really encouraged me to do something about it. And every time we met, have you done anything yet, Paul? You know?
You need someone like that, don't you, to kind of put the skates on you.
And I'm very grateful for Dimpna for pushing me. And eventually I did send it to various publishers in the States, because although it's an international story, you see this sort of thing happening today in different places. Yeah. It was set in California, so I went to look for American publishers, and you either heard nothing or thanks but no thanks. And then Out of the Blue Atmosphere Press came and said, "Yeah, we'd like to take this book on." I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. It took me 2 weeks to answer the email.
Are you serious?
I am
they
serious.
Must have thought you weren't
As
interested.
I sit here, I am serious.
Oh, I believe you.
So, yeah, okay, what's the next steps? So they were very good. They ran through the next steps with me and put me in touch with a gentleman called Philip Pantuso, who's based in New York. He's actually a journalist, but does a lot of editing. And he loved the book, but he suggested some structural changes, including putting the history leading up to the Mariposa Indian War, to put that in context. And he was absolutely right. I think that does put the fiction in context of what was happening in the middle of and prior to the 19th century, how California state came to be.
Absolutely, and that's all really interesting as well. I wouldn't have known any of that. We're almost out of time, unfortunately. You have a lovely website where people can find out more about you and about the book. It's called pauledmondsonauthor.com. Where can people get the book as well?
Well, because of the pandemic, I was supposed to be going over to California and do some readings and this sort of thing. So it just collapsed underneath me. So we decided to try and go everything online for obvious reasons. There couldn't be anything else.
And it's great that you can.
So the book was put up on the likes of Amazon. It's available on Amazon. It's on a book depository. It's available on Barnes & Noble, IndieBound. It's available. And as you said, it's available on my own website, so it can be purchased there.
Great stuff.
So that's the easiest. And I'll post it out to people and sign it for them. Great
stuff. It's The Great Spirit of Yosemite, the story of Chief Tenaya. Am I pronouncing that right? Tenaya. By Paul Edmondson, who is a Waterford-based author. Thank you very much for chatting to me, and people can find it online. Thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, thanks very much, Mary, for inviting me. It's very good of you.